Yeah, live. 7:06. Pretty close. Frosty cold beverage. Today, as I promised, tonight, excuse me, we want to talk about is it a myth? We want to talk about the notion that for some reason we're told by the experts that a dual plane intake manifold, a true dual plane, so we're going to define that in a minute. A dual plane intake needs a bigger carburetor than a single plane. I'm going to explain why, and then we're going to explain why that's nonsense. So you can kind of see where we're going with this myth busting. So let's jump right in. First of all, we have two kinds of carbureted intake manifolds that we're talking about because we're going to use them as a comparison because it's very important. So we have a single plane and a dual plane. On the dual plane, it's divided. So because you can have dual planes also that are not completely divided all the way up to the carburetor. So here's the discussion is on a dual plane manifold, the reason that they are saying that it needs a bigger carburetor because you are running half of the motor on half of the carburetor and the other half of the motor on the other carburetor. When you have a single plane that has a common plenum, either side, while it's drawing air and fuel, can be drawing from both sides of the carburetor, essentially all four barrels of the carburetor. So because it can do that with each single cylinder or each group of four cylinders on each side or each paired cylinder, or depending on the firing order, can then draw from the whole carburetor. So it's never restricted like one side is, or one cylinder or one side or one grouping is never restricted by only breathing through part of the carburetor. So that's the internet level of logic that they're talking about. And when you think about it, that makes sense, right? So if we can essentially half of the motor or part of the motor is running through a 2-barrel carburetor in a sense. So is that 2-barrel restrictive? Is that 2-barrel restrictive to the motor? Well, we got to think about this for a minute. So if we were running the motor with just a 2-barrel, where the whole motor had to breathe through a 2-barrel carburetor, certainly it would be restrictive, unless we had a really, really low power output motor that didn't need a lot of airflow, and the 2-barrel carburetor could supply enough airflow, air and fuel, that it could support the needs of the motor, then that wouldn't be a problem. But we're talking about, let's use like a 400 horsepower, only because it's easy math when we do this. So we use a 400 horsepower small block. We're running a 4-barrel carburetor on it, probably a 650 carburetor, something like that. Even a 750. So that's no longer the situation. We're not having the whole motor breathe through a 2-barrel. We're having essentially half of the motor breathe through a 2-barrel and half of the motor breathe through the other 2-barrel. So the question becomes this, and here's the question that I would pose in talking about this and talking to the people about this. First of all, if you're thinking that a dual plane manifold needs more than a single plane, here's why I don't think that that's the case. There's a couple of reasons. First of all, I have to assume that whatever the motor is, forget about what intake manifold is on it, what is the power output of the motor? So if we have a 400 horsepower small block Ford, we've got a small block Ford dual plane carburetor or dual plane carbureted intake manifold up on the thumbnail. We'll talk about that. But it could be anything. So the first thing that I would want to make sure is, if we're talking about we need a bigger carburetor for the dual plane because we're restricting, because we're having half of the motor breathe through one and half breathe through the other half. If we're restricting it, the first thing that I want to know is, do we have enough carburetor for the motor? So let's look at the motor. How much power does the motor make? Let's say it's got a dual plane on it. It makes 400 horsepower. So we know, using math and airflow data that we gather from an air turbine, that when we have a 400 horsepower motor, it flows about 600 CFM, because it's about 1.5 CFM per horsepower. It can be different than that based on its brake specific air consumption number. Some of them are really efficient, some of them are less efficient. And also, here's the thing to think about. It doesn't need 600 CFM at 3,000 RPM because it's not making the 400 horsepower at 3,000 RPM. It's only making that at the power peak. In fact, it's the airflow needs of the motor, the air processing ability of the motor continue with RPM. The airflow goes up. Even if the power goes down, the airflow goes up unless you run into valve flow. So as engine speed goes up, so does airflow. The airflow needs of the motor, the amount of airflow that it's processing. So if we have a 400 horsepower motor at its power peak or at its power peak, it's going to be flowing about 600 CFM, let's say. Okay, so if we have a carburetor that will support that airflow, so let's say we have a 650 or even a 750, whatever carburetor we put on there, if the carburetor is big enough to support the needs of that motor and not be restrictive just based on the power output, my question to the people that think that a dual plane needs a bigger carburetor is, why does it need more carburetor? And here's the reasoning behind that. If we put a single plane on that same motor, on a 400 horsepower motor, and let's say we turn it from a 400 horsepower motor into a 420 horsepower motor, because a single plane typically on these kinds of things makes more peak power. Now, it makes less power through a lot of the curve than the dual plane does, but makes more power on top. So there's going to be a crossover somewhere. So here's the logic right here, and it shows with the dual plane. So the dual plane is providing what the people that are saying that or the single plane is providing what the people that are saying that the motor needs a bigger carburetor for the dual plane, the single plane is supplying that. So if the motor wants more airflow, because we're restricting it by having it with the dual plane, by having it breathe through half of the carburetor, and we're allowing it to breathe through all the carburetor with the single plane, shouldn't the single plane make more power through the whole rest of the rev range where they're saying that it's restricted? It doesn't do that. And also the single plane doesn't make more power on the top because of airflow. The single plane makes more power because of intake design. The single plane, if it makes 420 horsepower, will flow more air. So if one of those or the other of those needs more carburetor, the one that makes more power and flows more air is going to be the one that would need more carburetor, not the one that makes less and flows less. So this is why when somebody tells me this, in my opinion, somebody that tells me that is the same kind of individual that tells me that a big motor that makes 400 horsepower, we got a 400 horsepower 302 and we got a 650 carburetor on it, or 750, whatever we have on it. And then we have a 400 horsepower big block Chevy. The big block somehow will need a bigger carburetor. That's nonsense. They need the same size carburetor because they make the same amount of power. Now, if we back up and ask ourselves the question, can we put a bigger carburetor on a bigger motor? Yeah, because it has a lot of signal down low. It's not going to be lacking signal through the important part of the curve in the lower RPM range, where a smaller motor will. So it will tolerate a bigger carburetor, but that's not the point that they're making. They're saying that that intake design, when it's divided all the way, needs a bigger carburetor. If the carburetor is big enough as a whole, the four barrels is big enough to support the flow needs of the motor and the power output, why isn't half of the carburetor enough to support half of the flow needs or half of the power output of that same motor? And I've asked that question a number of times to people that have brought this up, and they can never answer that. There's never any logic behind that statement. And so this is why because if this was true, like I said, the single plane should make more power everywhere than the dual plane. And it doesn't do that. It only makes it at the top. And so it's, we could get into more airflow data and all that stuff, but really you see what I'm talking about. I mean, this is It should be now common sense. But I'm curious what people have to say. Well, curious enough that we'll make that our poll. Does a dual plane need a bigger carb than a single plane? Let's get my spelling right. That's better. Mr. Clean, that's me. My wife wishes that was the case. Ported dual plane. Yeah, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about how to make it better. We're talking about dual plane versus single plane and why people, for some reason, seem to think that this divided thing, only being able to breathe through half of the carburetor, is somehow a restriction when the whole carburetor is okay. And again, if you're using the logic that, well, we want the motor to be able to breathe through the whole carburetor the whole time. Okay, that's good. Then it should theoretically make more power if it does that. But that's not the case. If we put a spacer in there, we don't normally pick up power through most of the RPM range. We might pick up power up top because we're transitioning the design of the intake manifold from a single plane or from a dual plane to a single plane. So yeah, no, I don't think that that's the case. Really appreciate the time you spent on the dyno and all the information. Happy to help. You're sipping on looks like a Crown Royal Peach flavor. No, it's just orange soda. Sunkissed. I can't be drinking ice cubes. I can't have ice cubes. My drink cannot be cold. My Sunkissed orange soda can't be cold. No dogs barking. They sit and look out the window with their, like, kind of sit on their elbows basically, because they're golden retrievers. They think that they're guarding something. They bark at cats that walk by and stuff. 72 Chevy 3/4 ton had a 900 CFM carb on a 350 4-bolt mains. It had a 350 375 emblem on the side. So where did you get the 350 375 emblem? That wouldn't have been anything that they made in 72. It would only have been they never would have made a 350 that made 375. They made a 370 horse one, the LT1. Does a dual plane need more accelerator pump shot? I don't think that the I don't think it would. And your boosters are down leg, mixture quality considerations, lower velocity through boosters from larger venturi sizes, better mixture quality or not. None of that is part of the discussion here. If you want to talk about making the carburetor better for your combination, those would all be things that we could look at. But none of that affects what the discussion is today. Camaro, I agree, Richard. Wow. Must be the weekend. It's kind of confusing. I'm sure there's a scientific explanation. David Visor discussed this exact. I'd like to talk to David about that. I would like to see what he thinks about this. Where you want your torque at. Yeah, that's a decision for choosing between a single plane and a dual plane. But like when we talked about the other night, the specific thing about the 317 heads and the 706 heads, a lot of people went to a specific thing about octane and compression. And that's a good subject. And we've talked about that a couple of times actually. And that's a really good subject, but that's not what the subject matter was. Todd, how did you break your pistons? Let's see. Long runners versus short runners is dual plane versus single plane. It's kind of the same thing, although dual planes are weird and not just a runner length kind of way. No ice cubes. I can't have ice cubes. I'll risk it. First to go beverage. It's a rod knock. I can't believe it myself. When I return from the farm, pull the engine, find out if it was me during assembly or hard issue like a bad rod. That's weird. Too much torque to make it hard to hook up at the track. Yeah, all of that's possible. David's Vizard is a wealth of knowledge. Yeah, I like David. We get along really well. He's a good guy. He was the first guy actually to call me when I did my way back when I did my first book. And it was amazing hearing from him because I have all of his books. I'd read all of his stuff. He said, "Hey, I just want to let you know you're like the real deal. You're a dyno guy." It's the best compliment I could get from a guy, especially from somebody like David. Around a 1-inch open spacer on top of a dual plane with a 750 vacuum secondary Holly with big shooters and a light spring on the secondary. A little tuning, it seemed to be better. An open spacer will typically help at the top on a dual plane on the big end. Is there a better option than shorty headers? Have no room for standard headers. A long tube header, if that's is this on the small block? Just get the, if you're doing shorty headers, there might be mid lengths for small block Chevys if you could do that, but just make them big enough so that they flow enough and just don't worry about it. Bigger CFM carburetors help a dual plane Pontiac built to rev out way past 6,800. I wouldn't think that a big inch Pontiac, unless it's a smaller one, that a big inch Pontiac with a dual plane on it would want to rev it to 6,800. What's your method to size carburetors? I do it based on power output. Seems like a dual plane definitely wouldn't need a bigger carburetor. It seems odd to me, unless your uncle heard from a guy. That's right. I know a guy that knows a guy that talked to a guy whose second cousin. I did have 2 broken pistons, so I disassembled the engine. That's not good. Let's pull the pants, see if I can do repairs. Todd, you need to figure out what's wrong. Something's going on. If the other motor broke and then this motor broke, something is amiss. Single plane needs more jet because the signal's lower. I agree with that. Whenever we go from a single plane to a dual plane, we definitely have to do jetting on the carburetor. No such thing as too big of a carburetor. It's the signal that the carburetor booster will still deliver a fuel atomized, correct or not, after down test or street and track test. There is such thing as too big of a carburetor, and maybe not for wide open throttle at the power peak, but if we go from a 650 to a 950, the 950 is not nearly as good on the street. 750 Holly too big for a 351 Windsor with World Product heads and a stout cam. No, that would be fine. In fact, that would be the first carburetor that we would put on there. I always felt the pump shot is determined by 2 things: airflow at idle and the plenum size. Prestige, you made it. If you want to hop a Coke can in the parking lot with 3/4 cam, camel hump heads, 4-bolt main. That's right. You need a Dominator on there. How much beer does it take to build a race car? May have been 350, 370. 72 pickup 25 years ago. I don't even remember seeing that emblem, though. I'm not familiar with that emblem. It's not the size of the carb, it's how you use it. There you go. Just wondering, maybe that's why GM used an 800 Quadrajet. Of course, it has an adjustable air valve and secondaries. Yeah, that's kind of a nice feature to theoretically give you the airflow that you need and give you less when you need less. Richard, what can you recommend for a 4-300? I'm going to tow something with it. I'm building it more as a desert racer with a hitch and air helpers. Are there a bunch of cams available for that? I don't think that head has a bunch of airflow. Are you doing something for that? Probably mid-teens in a cam, I would guess. And is it still going to be fuel injected with a really long runner in it? Turbo Centro, the shorty headers for mock-up planning for long tube built. Turbo header kit to weld it up. Mid-length headers are available for many applications. JBA makes them for modular stuff. Yeah, I think that his is a small block Chevy. I can't figure it out. I may just buy a rotating assembly. Big cam stuff. Oh, yeah. If it's a super stock deal, that would be a really big cam. Would you recommend upgrading from the EFI 300 inline 6-cylinder intake to a performance carb intake? No, I think I would pick the EFI intake manifold over any of the carbureted intake manifolds, because if you want to go with shorter runners because you want to run more RPM, you have the ability to do that. You just build a new plenum and attach it to the middle section where those two things part, and you could make that happen if you want to do that. You're probably not going to need to, I wouldn't think, but I think you should run EFI because then you know that you're getting the same amount of fuel with all the cylinders. Can you put a dual plane intake on a cam meant for a single plane? Yes, a camshaft doesn't know what carburetor is on it or what intake manifold is on it. When we do our single plane, dual plane tests, it's just like doing a rec port, cathedral port, or a long runner, short runner. We run the same cam in it. And I know, and that's where this whole wrong cam thing came from, is that people saying, oh, but you need to match the cams of the cylinder head. And I'm like, no, you don't. Because it does the same thing. If you put a cam in it, it makes more power with one of the cylinder heads. It also makes more power with the other cylinder head. And it's the same thing. If you run a dual plane and a single plane, no matter what cam you run them with, there's going to be that single plane, dual plane difference. What you'll do is if you run a mild enough cam, you'll get to a point where a single plane never does anything. It just never adds any power. All it does is loses power. There's no crossover point because your cam is like below that crossover point. If you put a really big cam in it, then you get to a crossover point going the other way. You'll never stop the dual plane from doing what it can do. But you could just make a situation or a combination where the single plane would be a better choice. Because if you're wanting an 8,000 RPM motor, you shouldn't have a dual plane on there anyways. 600 horsepower, small block Chevy, carb size. We would do at least a 950 on that, and 1,000 if you have it. And actually at 600, we might start be thinking about a Dominator on it. Saw you in Hemmings on the 4.8. Was that a Gen 4 4.8? The stock numbers were kind of impressive. I don't remember what year that thing originally was. That was Evans, and I was there while he was doing the testing on that, which was very cool. He ran it carbureted, and he had a really big camshaft in it. Will ping sound like a miss? You can get a misfire if it's lean. You can get enough detonation where you do misfire. And a lot of times you can see that as, if you're running it on the dyno, you can see that as puffs of smoke going out the back. And if it's audible pinging, obviously that's very noticeable. I used to subscribe to Trucks magazine. There was this series called Beer Budget Fuel Injection based on junkyard throttle bodies. His argument that was better than any carb could ever hope to be. There isn't a fuel injection is better than carburation, or carburation is better than fuel injection. If you run those two things, if you run a carburetor and port injection with a throttle body on the same intake manifold, the carburetor will make more power. And the carburetor will make more power because it has charge cooling. So if you run like the 4-hole throttle body on a single plane intake manifold, it has charge cooling, so it can make comparable power to a carburetor, and maybe a little more if you're able to dial in the tune just right. But usually the fuel injection carburation thing is, hey, we took this thing off, we put a carbureted intake manifold on it and a carburetor, and it made more power. Well, it made more power because of the intake manifold, not because of fuel injection. And obviously fuel injection there are lots of things that are good about both of them, but fuel injection, you can dial in the air fuel curve at every combination of RPM and load. And you can't do that with a carburetor. Eric and David are going to experiment with putting big carburetors on small blocks with a dual plane or big blocks. The problem with that is that there's not really, unless David's going to port some, there's not really big dual plane intake manifolds. Although we talked about the one the other night that's set up to accept a Dominator carburetor, and you can do that. I ran a Dominator on my small block Ford, so you definitely can do that. I found 2 or 3 of them. Oh, on the 300. Gives a firing order on a small block Chevy using a dual plane. Each port only sees a charge every 180 degrees of crank rotation. Cam motion, cam review, junkyard dog. I don't, Space Ops, if you tell me what the specs are on that cam, I could probably give you an idea on what it will do. I'm going to set the turbo up for 500 horsepower on E85 when I do it. Okay. I wouldn't think that would be that hard to do with, even if you didn't do any porting on the head, but with the right runner EFI intake manifold on that Ford 300 and a camshaft and springs on it and ring gap, I think you're there with the turbo. I don't think that would be that hard. I mean, there's only a charge requirement on each half of the intake every 180 degrees of crank rotation. Yeah, no, I get that. But the internet argument, though, is that they're simplifying it way more than that. They're simplifying it that, hey, it's restricting it because, and again, we're using a generic thing here, is that the motor can't breathe through the whole carburetor. It can only breathe through half of it. And so that's the level of logic that's there, not where you're going and not where I just went. I had mids back in the day on my Camaro. I'd like for Richard to do a test on them versus long tubes. I've done long tubes and mids and shorties, and long tubes make the most. They make more power everywhere. Shorties made the least, and mids make between those two, depending on how mid it is. If it's only 2 inches longer than a shorty, you don't change it very much. If it's longer enough that it makes a difference. And then also, did you change the primary diameter? Did you change the opening exit? You know, did you change the collector on the mid header? I mean, other things can affect that too. Anybody in Texas go to Yellow Belly drag strip? Johnson wants to know. The same boat with a 454 Gen 6 pickup. Only Gibson and JBA shorties made for that chassis. Had been hooker long tubes were discontinued. Yeah, they stopped doing a lot of that stuff. They even make a sheet metal upper for the 300 Ford. Yeah, you can. That's what I was talking about. You could just, well, and I wouldn't even do that. I would just use what's there. And if you want to shorten it, just put a plenum on the shortened section of the, because it cuts it like, I want to say in half, but I don't think it's exactly in half. You could put a roots blower on it. Yeah, guys have mounted carburetors, have cut and welded flanges to mount carburetors on the EFI intake manifold. That's also possible. Maybe multiple carburetors. All of that's cool stuff. 89 351 Windsor, stock bottom end with world product Windsor senior heads. Trick flow stage 1 cam, currently running a 650. How much would it pick up with a 750? Not a lot. I would say probably at the most it would be 8 or 10, but that's only assuming that both the 650 and the 750 are both tuned properly. If you have a 650 that's out of whack and you put a 750 and the 750 tune is more spot on, you could get more than that. But when we put them on there and we do a 650 and then we do a 750, both of them are right. So you got to make sure when you're testing them that that's the case. Maybe I could even do a dual quad Terminator X Dominator EFI. Space Ops 232 244. Let's see here. I'm gonna scroll back and see. So I can remind myself. Oh, that's the junkyard dog cam. Okay. 232, 244, 626, 604 on a 111. I think that cam is going to do what the Comp 459 cam does, or 469 cam does. And it might be a little bit better down low in the middle-ish kind of thing, because it's a 111. It has a less exhaust duration. So I think it's going to be a little softer up top, maybe. Turbo Central, look at Schoenfeld headers. That's who Westech had do a bunch of their dyno stuff. Have you run a 4.7 cam swap? Yes, we have. On both small blocks and big blocks. My uncle and stepdad used to build straight 6s, 350s, and 4 Lima engines back in the 60s, 70s, and 90s for dirt track. They used the 2.3s a lot in that stuff. What horsepower for a 6-liter, 799 heads, a Trek Norris cam, and a fast LSXR intake manifold? I don't know. 460 or something like that? 470? How long does it say for 85 to sit in your tank undriven or in a jug? If it's in a jug and it's sealed, it will last longer. If it's in your tank and your tank is not sealed, it's not going to last as long. O2 was good, 0.8, but it was missing at 5,500 on the 85. Not a meth with tune for each oil on one plug. Do you have a bad valve seal or something? According to David, you'll only see a difference with a larger car versus a smaller on a dual plane if the dual plane has been ported well. This would confirm your statement. So then it's just the fact that you're putting the carburetor on not a 400 horsepower motor, but now a 425 horsepower motor where you would need more carburetor. Oh, Dean, you voted yes. Hooker had a Super Comp 2-inch primary and 3.5-inch collector. Average primary length 31 inches to fit a 454. Looking to do. Westech is throwing away hundreds of headers from all of their dyno testing because they're just not going to, there's just not room for them anymore. Looking to do a 6-liter, 799 heads, low buck truck, S480 single turbo. Will have a good boost response on Suburban. Yes. In a 6-liter with that truck, with that camshaft, on an S480, you're going to be fine. You have to achieve intake manifold vacuum before the carb will pull fuel through the nozzles. You have to have air flow through the carburetor. That's not the same thing as vacuum in the manifold. Because if that was the case, at wide open throttle, where there's no vacuum, where you have the most amount of flow, you don't have the most amount of vacuum. My friends are all taking bets on where my engine is going to make peak power. I say 6,800. What size motor is that? Is that the 6-liter? The peak power, you have a fast LSXR trick flow 215s. So what size is it? You had a Lexus advertisement that you had to see? Those are important. I hope you watched all of it and clicked on it and bought something. That actually does nothing for me. Getaway, what's going on? Once you hit 300 horsepower in a straight six, it's hard to get any horsepower without a turbo. We need a header harvester fund. We do, because there's probably a lot of really expensive headers up there that I'm sure that are just going to get tossed, because I don't have room for them. Otherwise, I would have taken a bunch of them. The advisor just talked to Edelbrock asking to make a big block Chevy, good flowing dual plane to accept a 4500 Dominator. They made one already. They had a dual plane for a big block that had a Dominator flange on it already. I think it was, somebody said it was a C454 was the part number. Trying to figure out what LS combination to get. I spent a day watching your LS videos. So many great LS combinations. I just don't know. Just tell us what kind of power you want to make and what you're trying to make the power for. Like what's the application? We can kind of steer you in the right direction. How much less fuel efficient is a Gen 2 LT1 once you convert to carburetor? Are you talking about fuel mileage for it? I think the fuel mileage is going to be less with a carburetor, because it's not going to have any way to feedback and keep it at, like when you're cruising, it's not going to keep it at 14.7 or wherever the design is for that ECU. It won't do that. You won't get it to like just stay at 14.7. So it could be all over the board depending on how you tune the carburetor. Except Dean wants to do it with antimatter. DCI Don Johnson 2 weeks ago. It's Wednesday Night Live. We discussed Pontiac V8 dual planes with large CFM Holly 4150. He tells us that the track factory iron intake did the best 11-second car. I thought that, I mean, everyone has told me that the factory intake is really, really good. That's why the motor bogs. Okay. It bogs at wide open throttle at maximum RPM. I haven't pulled the center engine apart. I think the rings are stuck. Consumed an eBay turbo. That's not good. AMC. What did AMC do, Dean? They used the Autolite 600, 4300 and got more power out of it. Are you saying that they used a feedback carburetor? Is that what your comment is? Lots of OEMs did that. Chevrolet did that with the Quadrajet. I think Ford did it with theirs too. Don just swapped intakes, had like 7 aftermarket ones. I'm surprised that nobody could make something better, because that intake was designed a long time ago. The Pontiac dual plane intake manifold was designed a long time ago. And it was designed for motors that were not doing what the motors that they're testing those on do. You know, because a stock motor was making 350 horsepower, 400 horsepower, whatever the number is. It's not making 100. It wasn't designed to make 100 more than that. So I'm surprised that they did that good of a job, but that's kind of awesome, though. So your 348 with a 215 head, and it's like a 235 cam, it's not going to be 7,000. Yeah, the feedback Quadrajet. Yeah, that's what I was talking about. Is there a way to calculate ideal degrees of timing from compression ratio and fuel type? No. The timing that the motor is going to want is actually going to be much more a function of the chamber design. They used a Ford Carb. One of them 6970 Rambler SC things got a Ford carburetor on it. What's a Ford carburetor? The Autolite one? Was that a Ford carburetor, or was Autolite owned by Ford? I've been running dual what? 6772 factory iron is a near copycat of the 63 NASCAR SD421 intake manifold. That's cool. Well, like I said, I'm giving them props. I said, obviously, they did a good job. It just surprises me that something that they did back in the 60s, that an intake manifold that they designed back in the 60s, that they couldn't have made something better by now. I'm here late, starting from the beginning. Only thing I could think of, perhaps it impacts some engine firing order at part throttle. Road touring car, I want horsepower, AC reliable car, something I can take to the track every day. So often drive up and down the coast. So 600 or 700 horsepower from a Camaro, you're going to want boost in it, right? So that makes it easy. If you want an NA thing, it's not going to be a nice driver thing, because 600 or 700 horsepower is going to be some kind of really big, cantankerous, large cam stroker deal, and it's not going to be fun to drive around. But the good news is 600 to 700 horsepower is a very small cammed 5.3 with a turbo on it. Reference Ben Alameda's work in recent video on vacuum secondary carbs. I'm pretty familiar with what they do. I like Ben's stuff. I saw a video turning an Edelbrock AVX carburetor into a blow-through. Seems simple. I don't know what you mean by thoughts. Yep, the Ford-owned Autolite 4300 A-Carb. So did they own Autolite? That's my question. Was that a division of Ford, or was Autolite its own company? Would a Gen 4 intake swap on a 92 millimeter throttle body, or replacing stock exhaust manifolds with headers on a 402 stroker, sloppy stage 2 cam, ported something heads? If you're asking if replacing the intake manifold, an early truck intake manifold with a Trailblazer SS or Gen 4 style intake manifold is going to be better, yes, it is. And even more so on a 402 stroker. Richard, what would be a good duration cam for stock LS1, or should I start with the intake or heads first? Your first thing on the LS should be a camshaft. That's going to get your biggest gain. So, but you need a cam, you're going to need a tune, and I don't remember what injectors are in the 5.7, but you might, because you're going to, with even like with my cams, you're going to add somewhere between 65 and 75 horsepower, 60 to 75 horsepower. And so can your injectors support that much more power? So they might not be able to if they're stock ones. But camshaft would definitely be the first one. And the two cams I have, if it's going to be a driver, a car that you're driving around, either one of those will work really well. Hydroponic engineer Malcolm McKellar was really smart. I don't doubt that at all. But even no matter who they are, what they did in the 60s, this is 60 years later. So technology has changed from then. So my point is, I'm surprised that given the fact that they made an intake manifold, their design goal was not to make the best dual plane intake manifold ever devised by man. I know that because that's never the design goal of any factory piece. So never in the history of any of the OEMs has that been the design goal. So my point is, they made it for factory applications to be cost effective, to fit, to be easy to bolt on, to make the power that they need, all of the things that they were doing even back then. This statement doesn't put anybody down, but that seems to be how you're taking it. I'm surprised that they haven't made a better intake manifold than that. That's my point. It's 60 years later. Something better should have come out by now. That somebody should have been able to do that. And if they haven't, that's just more props to that original design. Aluminum 5.3, aluminum will be good for horsepower. Yeah, you can. It doesn't really matter. You can run an iron one or an aluminum one. The aluminum one's going to be lighter and will be better for power to weight ratio. I can't think of any engine that does 7,000 with a fast. Yeah, 4.8 definitely does. And I'm trying to think of what. I don't think we were at. I don't think we were ever at 7,000 with the with any of the cams on the 5.3, not with a fast on it. Let's see. So that's 6,500 with a stock intake manifold on it. Then when we put the fast on it, actually it wasn't really any higher than that. Still like 6,500. That was with a red hot cam. You have more camshaft than that. But I think it's going to be, although that wasn't with a good head either. I would concur with your 6,800 thing. I still don't think it's going to be 7,000. John Johnson discussed how important plenum volume is in a single versus a dual plane. That I would like to hear that. I would like to see information on that. The test that I want to do on plenum volume for carbureted intake manifolds is I want to run a plenum volume test on carbureted intake manifolds. And I want to run plenum volume tests on a dual plane and a single plane, carbureted. And then I also want to do those same manifolds with port injection on them and then change the plenum volume the same. And see if if what we're seeing is just a change in the signal to the carburetor, which we know affects power, or if we're seeing a resonance frequency change, which is Helmholtz resonance from a change in plenum volume, if that is doing anything. Because I know that altering plenum volume can affect the signal to the carburetor. We see that a lot. But what I don't know is, or what I haven't correlated that yet with, and because every time I do a plenum volume test, when it's port injected, the plenum volume does almost nothing, but yet can have a fairly sizable effect on a carbureted combination, which leads me to believe that it's carburetor related, fuel flow related or atomization related, that kind of thing, and not like a resonance frequency from the plenum volume. I've been running a dual plane intake with an open spacer for 50 years. That's a long time. Many different applications from stock to high RPM with good results. I don't know what that statement means. I would be surprised if you ran a 8,000 RPM with a dual plane and an open spacer, that it was making good power there. That an 8,000 RPM sure seems like single plane material for me. Ford had to sell it because it held Presolite and Holley patent, spark plug market, a whole bunch of levers. Oh, supported by Ford. Okay, I didn't know that. Yeah, I just didn't know who owned it. Hi, how are you doing? How come you're breathing so hard? Because you were protecting us? I know. How much stall is needed for the camshafts? On a 5.3 and a 6.0 on the low buck truck camshaft, you just use a stock converter. You might be able to get away with that one with on the 4.8, although I think it would be better. All of them would be better with another converter, because another converter, even with a stock camshaft, will be better. Your car will accelerate better if you put a converter in it. And that holds true for all the camshafts. But you can run a stock converter certainly on a 5.3 and the 6.0. On a 4.8, I would recommend a converter. Back in the 80s, we'd use a hot cam and a big quadrajet with a aluminum intake. We tie off the vacuum secondaries with a wire to get good gas mileage, just to stop you from going into the 4 barrels. Because the PMD market got shut down in just 3 years. Engineering had free range back then. 73 emissions failure of the Vega Cosworth and the Super Duty 455 were bad on making new alloy intake manifolds. Some of the small block intake manifolds were aluminum, some of the factory ones. From 73 to 76, PMD stopped all its outsourced development. Hawley and Edelbrock only did things that made money. I digress with the principal function of the MAF on injection engines. I don't know what you mean by you digress on MAF injection engines. I don't know what that comment means. Holley split intake for an LS will be a great abrasive test. I've already run the split intake manifold. I remember the factory 1970 LT1 dual plane was really good. Excellent street performance. A friend of mine has a rare Holley copy. Cat improved. Forgot the name, but number 2. Was that intake better than any of the previous dual planes that like they would have used on the 69 DZ302 or the previous 327 stuff? Art Campbell, formerly from Holley, discussed how bad intakes were in the 70s. Is the low buck truck sold on Amazon? No. There's only one source for that, and that's me. What about LS1 stuff? Yeah, I have lots of LS1 videos going up. I'm trying to get 400 wheel horsepower NA with an LS1. So it's 500 flywheel. That's certainly possible. Should join us on Pontiac V8 DCI Wednesday night. That sounds good. I'd like to listen in on that. Remember, David did a dyno test using Edelbrock Performer and cut the divider and did another dyno pull. I did a bunch of that on the Engine Masters motor that I did because I used a dual plane. I was the only guy to do that, I think. Certainly the only guy in the finals that did that. And we started cutting it a little bit, and then more, and then more, and then more, and then we ended up making another divider and putting it in there, and then we did tried an adapter to go from a 4500 to from a 4100 to a 4500, and then brought the divider up into the 4500 adapter. We did lots of kind of cool stuff. .500 wheel horsepower is possible with an NA LS1. Yeah, that would be a race motor. That would be 600 flywheel horsepower with an LS1. Takes a lot of stuff. Turbo Sentra. So yes, better than the 327. Unsure of the DZ302 single 4-barrel. I think that I think it'd be interesting to do because the guys at Westech have a bunch of those manifolds, and there's a lot of different versions of those for the different years and the different power outputs for the motors. There's a whole bunch of different configurations of those. It'd be interesting to run those. Just specify what the casting number is and then run them and just see how they do. All right, Dean, we'll see you later. How's our poll doing? Does a dual plane need a bigger carb than a single plane? 69% are saying no. I'm actually a little surprised about that, given the comments that I've gotten. I know my Z28 had a pretty decent size plenum on it. It's relatively high rise for a factory intake manifold. Your Z28 should have had a divided intake manifold, right? It should have had a dual plane intake manifold with a full divider in it. They weren't cutting dividers, and if it's a 69, because I ran a 69 and we had a 69 intake on it. LS exhaust manifolds are almost as good as shorty headers, and there's a few different designs of LS exhaust manifolds too. It'd be better to leave the LS1 and go to a 4853 or 60. Well, if you're wanting to make more power, the 60 would be better than a 57. It will make more power. If you're trying to do 500 wheel horsepower NA, even a 6-liter is going to be very expensive because it's going to take aftermarket heads. It's going to take a big camshaft. It's going to take a big intake manifold. It's going to take long tube headers. It's going to take all of that stuff. And so it's way easier to just do it with boost and way less expensive. Like 550 from a 6-liter or 560 or 70 from a 6-liter NA is pretty easy. 600 is harder. Those last little bit get to be difficult. Near. There. If boost is the way to go, should I stay EFI or go the carb? I like the simplicity of carbs over EFI. I would say EFI would be better. You could do it as a blow through carb, but it's so cheap just to get, like, follow along with. Go look at Matt Happel's stuff from Sloppy. He's got tunes. So if you get the 80-pound injectors and get a 78, 75 turbo, an intercooler, get those 80-pound injectors, get a fuel pump, get his tune, and it's going to work. From talking about LS1s, from what I remember, 98 to 2000 motors had weak rods. They had different rods in the early motors. That's the first time hearing about that. Full divider, original intake, the car was built with, I'm sure. CSU, I heard, that has the best 4150 boost carburetors. They are good. I like Kevin's stuff. You got a second ad break? Have you ever done any oval track motors? Only some 2-barrel stuff. But I'm not a race car engine builder. I do dyno testing. I saw a video of yours where you did a twin turbo on a 5.3 with 5.9 pounds of boost and it made 700 horsepower. Yeah, that's because that's mostly because the 5.3 that we put together made a lot of power NA. So the more power you make NA, the more it gets multiplied under boost. So it's not that hard. So if you have a 500 horsepower NA motor and you add 7.5 pounds, it could make 750. And so that's how the multiplier works. So the more NA power you make, it gets easier to make power under boost. I was pretty proud of 478 at the rear wheels through a 9-inch with the 430 gear and a T56. That is good. I was also thinking nitrous would be a good way to get 500. Yeah, that's easy. That's a motor with a cam and then not a very big shot. So it's like 100 shot. And if you're not there, then it's 150 shot, and that works too. And the nice thing about the nitrous is that you're not using that kind of power all the time. Although I have to say that if you have a nitrous car and you have a turbo car, you drive them differently. Like, you get to enjoy the turbo car more because you can enjoy like a little bit of boost at part throttle and stuff like that, and not be raging it around. Usually, when you're doing nitrous, you're committed. You're all into doing the thing that you're doing. And with turbos, it doesn't have to be like that. You can enjoy it more, I think, as a part throttle thing. The specific camshafts for oval track restricted 2-barrel and vacuum rules, Isky cams, Crowder and Schneider. Yeah, the cams that people were using were lift rule cams, and then that's where the David Vizard, like, very, very tight LSA stuff comes in, because all of those were very tight and with a lot of ramp rate stuff, because you didn't care about idle quality. And I've seen guys there's guys out there running around with, if what they were telling me was accurate, fairly big spreads in variations in duration for those camshafts. Sloppy type combos where my RH truck plus is headed. That will be good. That will make a lot of power. I just hope you have a transmission for that, because It's going to make some power. I honestly thought that the single plane dual plane thing with respect to carburetor would be more of a thing. Keith Thornton has done some crazy 289 cars with tiny carburetors. Keith Thornton knows how to make power. We've run lots of Perry for your turbo carbureted questions. We've run lots of those on the dyno. I haven't run those on the street though. So if you're driving around, I don't know. Kevin swears to me that they drive around just fine. I haven't. We haven't ever done that, so I don't know if that's the case. The thing that concerns me is not so much with the carburetor and not so much the fact that it's a blow through, but the intake manifolds that you would be using on there don't lend themselves to equal distribution. A single plane manifold is not very good for fuel distribution. And so it would be hard, I would think, other than having it, sequential with individual cylinder tuning capability, to be able to ensure that you get equal air fuel in all the cylinders. Got 1 more minute. But you guys, have a good weekend. $59, $58. So general when using turbos for towing with regard to temperature and how pulling along grades with heavy loads, how much intercooler would be needed? Well, you want enough intercooler, obviously, to continue to cool it. But when you're pulling a long grade, you're probably not at, well, no, on a turbo, you might be at maximum boost for a long time. So hopefully you're not at very high boost, and that just like your cooling system, that the regular cooling system for the radiator and the fans and all that stuff, that it's overkill for what you're doing while you're just driving around. The intercooler should also be like that. It should be overkill for what you're doing, because it should be designed to, most people would take an intercooler and make it be, okay, their combination is going to be like, it's going to make 1,000 horsepower. But while they're driving around and while they're just driving around on the street, or they're not usually using it at that power level. And so if you're using it at 6 or 7 pounds or whatever, like you might be when you're towing, the intercooler sizing is overkill for that anyways. And so it has excess capacity to do what you're talking about. What intake would you run on a 351 Windsor with a blow through carburetor? That's not enough information. Are you drag racing it? Idle timing on a 572 crate motor. Is it a carbureted one? Is it got a distributor? What's it doing? All right, Dean. We'll see you guys later. I will see you guys all tomorrow.